All right, let's go.
Okay. I'd like to open the meeting of the Norwood Planning Commission for May 4th, 2022 at 3:30 PM. We're going to start with the roll call. Mayor Schneider,
Present.
Chairman Powers,
Present.
Mrs. Sickinger,
Present.
Mr. Hockney,
Present.
Mr. Sewer.
Present.
Do I have a motion on the floor?
I'd like to make a motion to have Bernie serve as our chairman pro temp for the day.
May I have a
I'll
second?
second.
Thank you, Chairman.
That's confusing.
Sorry. Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Chairman Powers,
Yes.
Mrs. Sickinger,
Yes.
Mr. Hockney,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer.
Yes. Okay. I'll get started here. The first agenda item, item B, is approval of the minutes of 4/6/22. And Carrie distributed those to all members, and I think this is a discussion point for all the members. Would it be more appropriate that we hold this and let everybody read it? Would you rather take the time now to let everybody read them and then we make a motion? I don't want to automatically say either way. What's the,
I think we can wait until the next meeting to approve these. They're lengthy because there was quite a bit of public conversation and discourse, or not discourse, but discussion. So unless other members feel we need to approve them today, otherwise let's table them until next time so we have a chance to digest them fully.
so Carrie, if you would, put it on the agenda for next meeting that we approve then both meeting minutes. We carry this one forward and then we'll approve the meeting minutes from the May 4th meeting.
Thank
Okay?
you.
I don't need to make a motion on that. Going on to the item C. Would you like me to put that under old business?
Either that or communications. A motion to amend the agenda, maybe?
I'd like to make a motion that we amend the agenda for an item E, which will be a formal communication from the New City Presbyterian Church. And everybody should have a copy of what they submitted to the city. And we'll cover it when we get to it as item E. We'll do the other ones first.
I would approve that motion.
I'll
Second?
second it.
Carrie?
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Chairman Powers,
Yes.
Mrs. Sickinger,
Yes.
Mr. Hockney,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer.
Yes. The other part of that, I guess, is to be really clear, the adjournment then becomes item F. If we're amending the agenda. All right, let's go on to old business. Ongoing zoning ordinance amendment review. And everybody should have received a handout in your packet that is noted as the 4/7/22 revision. And this, I believe, has been submitted, Mike, in review with others. And also, you've taken into account a lot of the discussions from the previous at least 3 meetings on these topics. I think everybody probably has read them. Why don't we do item A first? Mike, why don't you go ahead and just recap what we have written there as item A?
Sure. So good afternoon, members. The item C1A primarily was distributing the revised 13-page draft zoning ordinance amendment, which reflects the suggestions that commissioners made on the last meeting. And, primarily the key ones we're looking at not going through with the use variance, cleaning up the language for the fence policies. And pretty much that was about it in terms of the key discussion items that we had reflected in the minutes. So my recommendations to the commission is to essentially take a look at it. If you have questions right now, I'm happy to discuss it, but essentially what you see in front of you is the edited, clean version that we have.
Because I'm new at this position, is the next step typically when they get to where the planning commission believes there's a draft that's ready for incorporation into an ordinance, that we would make a motion that it would go to the law department? Is that historically been the process here? What?
At least from, and the chair's on the phone, my understanding through discussions that Noah had, he didn't want to burden council with umpteenth separate zoning ordinance amendments. So he would rather, I believe, have a decent amount of suggestion text amendment before that's brought to council.
Thank you, Mike. I do remember that. I guess once we get all of the ones that we feel like in this first bucket of modifications, is that the next step then? It goes to the law department?
Correct.
Okay,
So I think once you guys are comfortable that you have a sufficient zoning ordinance amendment, and it doesn't have to be the complete kitchen sink. You could have enough that, hey, we're ready to proceed, and you want to let it go for a more formal review.
Okay. Well, I think that I'm in agreement that we, the planning commission, either talk through these and get to a point where we approve this draft, to at least set it aside and continue to review, and that's really the next item, the next priority items under item C. That's your point.
Correct,
And I think,
yeah.
Noah, that was your point as well. Let's get these together into one group, then submit them to the law department as one ordinance at that time.
Yeah, so we could either, at this point, look at that particular 13 pages that are right now prepared, and whether it's this meeting or next meeting, saying, fine, we think we have a decent amendment, proceed with that separately, and then the planning commission will continue on with further amendments, and in another 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, submit another application or another amendment to the law department and to council.
Safety Service Director Powers, do you have any thoughts on that? Is that our recollection correct?
Yeah, that is correct. You know, what I wanted to do was avoid sending these to council in ones and twos, but I also want to avoid sending them an avalanche of things to consider all at once as well. So I think kind of the volume that we have here is probably about what we would want to ask them to take in one bite.
Okay, so the next step is to send it from the Planning Commission to the Law Department for them to prepare and they'll do a review of it and then prepare a revision to the ordinance that was passed that would then be put to council. That is what would happen.
Prior to that, you have to have a public hearing. At this point, no notification has gone out to anybody as far as there's a public hearing to make a recommendation to council about zoning or about changes. So whether you send it to the law department for them to look at and then bring it back and have a public hearing, or whether you have your public hearing and then send it to the law department to prepare for council and you make recommendation to council, would be up to
So
you.
it would seem to me, thank you, because that's the reason I was asking
Logical
process. I had not been through the process. I actually would rather everybody read this as tightly as you can, and we come back next month and then just make that, you need to know right now if it's going to be if it's a public hearing and the notification.
If at the point you want to make recommendation to council, you have to have a public hearing for that. So either you can ask the law department to look at it and see if they see anything that should be different than what you guys have decided, or you can hold a public hearing and then ask the law department to create the ordinance for council, because you're making a recommendation to council.
We just have to make a choice, it seems like. Do we send this to the law department first?
We don't have to make a choice. I mean, my motion would be to send this to the law department for review and to set a public hearing for our next meeting on this. It gives us a month to look through this and figure out and it gives time for the law department to look at it and say this is good or bad. Then we have the public hearing at that time, and then we can move forward from there.
Perfect.
I agree with Mayor Schneider.
Do we need a motion on this?
Yeah, I would make that motion. We send the proposed amendments to the planning and zoning code to the law department for review, and we set the public hearing for the next meeting.
I second that motion.
Is there any discussion? Mayor Schneider?
Before you do that, just real quick discussion. I do see this, I think that what has happened in the city of Norwood is this has been set in stone. It was passed, it was not amended, it was just passed, and then it sat there, and the building department did a great job administering it over year after year after year. And I do think that part of what the Planning Commission should be doing is looking at this, and this should be a living, thriving document. It should be something that changes every once in a while with the recommendations of community members, with the recommendation of BZA members, with the recommendation of the staff, professional staff. And that's what we are doing. This is a working planning commission. This is what we should be doing. So I think this is the right move. So that would end my part of the discussion. I apologize that I didn't speak up when you said discussion, but other discussion or call the roll.
Any other discussion?
The only other discussion, since I've been on BZA for a long time, and it still am, I'm excited about this because we do see a lot of the same things coming forward into BZA that take staff time.
Yeah.
And I think we can make it a little bit simpler. We have good staff, and I think Mike has made it clear to me that he sees that in other municipalities to be looking at those things. So I think I support what you just said, Beck, and I think that's why both groups, I think we can work together very closely. So, okay.
Any other discussion? Would you like me to call the roll? Thank you.
Call the roll.
Mayor Schneider?
Yes.
Chairman Powers?
Yes.
Mrs. Sickinger?
Yes.
Mr. Hockney?
Yes.
Mr. Sewer?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. That was item A, C1A. C1B, discussion of tabled items for permeable porous paving. Mike, you want to recap this for us again from last month?
Sure. I've kind of bundled item B into kind of three things. So there has been discussion, as we've had at council, at the BZA, and at the Planning Commission regarding permeable porous paving, engineered structures, however you would like to call it. So that was something that was left for this meeting, just to kind of have further discussion and at least determine the Planning Commission's interest for that as to how they would proceed.
You want to do these one at a time? Mike, is that
Correct. I'll just give a quick
Okay.
overview. So that was item 1, and then item maybe 2 and 3 as part of that kind of dealt with suggestions that Mark Reeves, the building inspector, raised, and that was presented in a one-page document. That led me to question concerns I had with the law department, which have now been clarified. And that was the question as to, can the city, based on either case law, common law, actually prohibit certain uses if we find them not appropriate for the city or unnecessary. And based on discussions I had with Keith Moore, and we already have that in the zoning ordinance, and I cited section 112105B, where certain things like a plasma center, check cashing places, flea markets, etc., are all prohibited from the city. So Keith Moore's response was that, you know, based on his experience, there's nothing, at least he's aware of, that would exclude us from doing that. So following up with regards to the Mark Reeves suggestions, things such as, you know, ancillary agricultural uses, cemeteries, having fraternities, sorority houses could also be excluded.
Without having to list them? Is that the?
Well, I think we would have to list them, but essentially, right now, for example, agricultural uses, or you would have, I don't know, I think some municipalities are big on to having chickens in their backyards or whatever, so that would be outright prohibited. So, again, that's something it seems that the city could do, and therefore the Planning Commission could recommend either support or leave it as is. And then the other big one was essentially revisiting the RMX zone. Now that in particular requires a little bit more thoughtfulness, because now that we're dealing with a spatial area, that's also a map change. So as long as we're making text changes, it's a very easy exercise for us to do.
Could you help me understand again what RMX is?
Sure. So the RMX zone, essentially from my understanding of the history, was created to deal with an area of the city that had a number of multiple units. And a multiple units is essentially 3 or more dwelling units in one single structure. And they essentially, my understanding, created the zone to at least further prohibit more conversions. So some municipalities right now do the opposite. They try to allow for accessory units, et cetera. Because of the history, I believe it occurred around the time of GM, where a lot of these old buildings, Victorians, were converted. At that time, in the prior administration, they wanted to clamp down on that. So they created this RM zone to address that. Mark Reeves' position was that most of those units have now been either converted back to single family, so the basis and need for creating the RMX zone in the first place is no longer necessary. So his suggestion was just to convert it back to R2.
And the reason I bring that up is again, I never remember that being an issue in our BCA meetings of something, and I don't remember seeing it on the map. So is this a map zone called RMX?
Yes, sir.
Correct.
Okay.
It's,
All right.
it's south of Williams, the south side of Williams, over and across Montgomery Road. And anything that had been an R1 or an R2 zoning district was changed to RMX. The language in RMX specifically states that if you had a 1, 2, or a 3 family at the time of the change, then you would be a conforming use. If you had a 4 or more, then you were still a non-conforming use. And the idea was to not create all of these non-conforming uses. But if you were to build new from ground up, it had to be a 1 family. So it took the R1 zoning district and the R2 zoning district and created the RMX. And while what Mike was saying happened during General Motors days, at this particular time, they were seeing a lot of student housing to where they were buying up 1 families and changing them into multifamilies so that they could get more than 4, the way our code reads, more than, a family is defined as by blood marriage, yours, mine, and ours kind of thing, versus, or no more than 4 unrelated. So by taking these one families and creating two families, they could get 8 kids or 8 students into a what used to be a one family. So they came up with this zoning language to try and stop some of that. Now, like Mike said, we no longer allow increased density in any R zoning district. By changing the zoning of the RMX, which it probably has accomplished what it was intended to do, but you will create non-conforming uses now out of perhaps the 3-family, or if you make it R2, or the 2 and 3 families if you make it R1.
So the way I read this in 1136, it was anything that existed
At the time.
at 2003.
And planning commissions had at least 2 public hearings on it. Council had, one of them had 3, one of them had 2. I did all the public notices for it. Susan Roschke was here. I helped Susan, I assisted Susan.
Okay.
We sent out cards to everybody in that district, plus 200 feet outside of it, all the property owners. It was advertised in the newspaper. They were told, this is how the city has your building listed as a use. If that's not correct, please call. And they called me. And they went through the steps because we didn't want to leave anybody who we thought was a 1-family, or we thought was a 2-family and it was a 1-family, or we thought it was a 1-family and it was a 3-family. We didn't want to leave any of that out. We wanted to make sure our records were correct. And
So
they
it
were
was,
given lots of
it was
opportunities.
self-administered by the people who lived there, not by the city. So in
Right.
other words, in 2003, you don't know for sure how many residents were in each building.
No, we did. The building
Okay.
department had records of what we thought was there
Okay.
from 1985.
It just
or
seems like
whenever
an
they did
I
it.
think I know why Mark wants this gone. Administrating it and enforcing it,
It becomes a
a
problem.
significant record-keeping issue, I would think. But, okay, that helps. I understand it. And I've read it repeatedly, and I figured that there was something that came up that somebody had to create an RMX district, and now I understand it. I'm wondering why that area of Williams only, because it's not the only area that started taking
was-
significant amount of single families and
Well, it was-
converting them to dormitories.
It was the south side of Williams all the way to the border.
No, I'm just saying, why Williams? Because that's not the only
At the
street.
time, it wasn't just Williams. At the time, they had not seen it go too far north of there.
Okay.
We're on 1B?
Yes, we're
Is
on
that
B.
correct?
We're really, there's 3 items in B, and we're honing in on the RMX district. And I don't have an issue with deleting it. And I guess I'm looking to Mark Reeves, who has been, in the middle of this, and Carrie, I'm just trying to figure out why it would make any difference if we did get rid of it, the district. It's a map issue.
Yeah, in terms of it, it just adds a different and additional zone, which is really unnecessary sometimes. I think when people submit things, it would be easier to have it more consistent with other zones. So based on what he informed me, the impetus for creating it is no longer necessary. And therefore, in terms of when, it's less about a lot of the overburden administrative. It's just, okay, we have another area that has slightly different provisions for it. So it's really not necessary. So that's what I said. It's one of those things where, at least for discussions right now, it's a more, I wouldn't say thorny, but it's going to take more time really to debate back and forth.
I agree.
So we could just discuss
Okay.
the generalities and leave it at that and have a further discussion. And we could even call Mark Reeves in to discuss it, from his practical standpoint. I'm kind of hot or cold about it first because I don't have a good history about it. Obviously, you heard from Carrie, she has much better. But, at least in terms of a very more simplistic discussion, action could be about the porous paving, if you want to kind of.
Well, do we want to make that request that Mark could stop in here on the first agenda item for the next meeting and give us the background in addition to what Carrie was saying, so we can do something with this? Or,
Yes, I think that's a good suggestion.
you know,
Good request.
Carrie, could you take the lead in getting and asking Mark if he would, and tell him what the issue would be, is we want to take his suggestion and understand it, and ask him to
A
come?
lot of time and effort putting it in place. A lot.
And it'll take just as much time and effort to remove it. You have to have public hearings, you have to notify everybody who owns property within the RMX zone. You have to notify everybody within 200 feet of that change. You have to have public hearings, and then you have to make recommendation to council, and they have to do the same thing, which is why,
Oh, we're not scared of work, Carrie.
no, I know that.
Well, we're not scared of giving you work,
Yeah.
Carrie.
And I don't have Susan.
Right.
Well, let's get Mark here to talk, help
Discuss
us
it more.
understand it, and then we'll go through the pluses and minuses. Maybe the best decision is to leave it just like it is.
That'll be up to you. I'm here to do what
It's
you
been
need.
since
Let's get more
2003.
information. Yeah, so let's,
Okay, next one, the porous paving. There was a document that I think everybody did receive at the last meeting, and Minneapolis had, I think, some very good language. If you remember in the back, there was a series of cities that had language that went in, and to me, and I don't know how much in detail you want to go into this tonight, but I personally would like to recommend, from the Planning Commission standpoint, that we do something that puts porous paving as an allowable for private drive, especially private driveways. And whether or not there's any other areas, but I think parking lots, the only difference there is actually, Carrie, you're the one that brought this up. I think there is some issues about certain types of shoes in these porous paving, these units, but, that's also the landowner's responsibility, just like it is a private driveway. I
that
think
was a
especially
private
where we have
conversation.
stormwater issues, and this is very, very common in municipalities. That doesn't make it right, but, so, what would be the recommended next step? Is there a strong opinion from any of the other planning commission members that we not at least continue the discussion on this topic of how do we get something approved?
I do not have a strong opposition to it.
I don't either.
No. Is it a motion that we would make to request that the law department presents us with a draft ordinance allowing porous paving within the city of Norwood, and then Tim and Keith can do some research? We can provide them with the information we have, but they can do some research and then bring it to us at the next one where we can review it and start from there.
What we've been doing is, I thought Mike, though, has been suggesting an amendment, putting together some draft. We have a draft from Minneapolis that he could send as a draft to the law department to help them, because I don't think they're going to understand like Mike understands the technicalities of porous pavement.
Yeah, so at this point, sorry to interject, so I submitted a 3-page combination kind of background fact sheet, and then the last page had essentially a suggested rewording for section 1153.12, which was, what prompted this whole thing. So it was just adding some language for private driveways, for commercial, and it really wasn't more than, let's say, 5 or 7 kind of sentences. I didn't spend any time really looking at Minneapolis's version. I remember going through it. I could look at that and focus on that, and then draft something up to give to the law department to review as a potential model amendment that he would like.
Right.
But it was basically, at this point, I don't have too much guiding parameters from you guys as to what you like and what you don't like, or what you want to see and what you don't want to see. So if your preference is, you said Minneapolis being pretty decent, I can take a look at that and edit it appropriately and then provide it to the law department.
I think it's a very good, it includes some engineering data
Okay.
that says the pavement has to withstand this type of foot-pounds of pressure, but then it also restricts it to driveways. So it can't be everything. And I don't know, it seems like, Mike, if you look at the Minneapolis and then take what you did last time, you submitted,
Okay.
and I think it would be very appropriate that you take the lead, and if you would, then we'll submit something, as long as the planning commission is in agreement, that we could bring that one back to the planning commission next month.
And that would
talk
be
through
my
it.
preference, so just, I'll take a quick stab at that and then bring it back here, and if you guys are good with it, green light it, and then we can.
Then we'll forward it on. So,
To bring it back.
Mike's going to look at the Minneapolis, couple it with what he drafted something at the last meeting, put together some background, and bring it back to the next meeting that we can review it as a planning commission, that we can support to go to the law department. Because we all agree in concept that we like the idea of a porous pavement.
My only concern with this is the timing of it. Everything that it's going to be months and months before we get things done if we continue down a route of constantly, okay. So my point being, Mike needs to share that information with us individually. Mike needs to talk to us at different times to say, I sent this as an email, and we all, as commissioners, need to send Mike back information to say, this is sort of my thoughts on it. Prior to the meeting, there can be conversations with Mike that are going back. There should not be a conversation with all four of us saying, let's do it that way and move forward. But we can provide Mike with feedback through this process so that when it comes down to the meeting, we can look at it and say, oh, that's interesting, that was a change I wasn't involved in, but this is something that was important to me, and it looks like Mike has it in there. So I'm worried that if we just meet once a month, it's going to take forever to get anything done, and especially if we're meeting and then we all say, well, change this, change that, change this, and then wait another month, and then, well, this didn't, you know what I'm saying? Maybe I'm belaboring the point, but Mike, as the point man, I would hope that you would keep this process moving so that when the commission does come back together, you've already got some insight from them and have a good understanding of what sort of the group is trying to accomplish.
Sure.
As long as it's one-on-one, people.
Right. I'm not talking as a group, I'm talking one-on-one.
Okay, well, that's
Porous pavement.
porous pavement. So that was two of the three items. And as far as Keith Moore responded, the city does not necessarily have to follow it. What do we need to do with that one?
Well, essentially what I would do, so we had earlier discussions about item 1A for those 13 pages, and that we're going to let it now go on for, let's say, for argument's sake, the next zoning ordinance text amendment document. I will start uploading these because to me, it's when you strike something out, it's a very quick exercise. It's not delete and replace, it's just delete, we don't need it. So that'll be a very quick wordsmithing. So I'll
Okay.
go ahead and do that, and we'll be on whenever you see the next document.
Very good. Any other questions on C1B? Okay. C1, I think we meant that to be C. I'm sorry, I missed that in the...
Correct, that's my mistake.
Okay, selection of the next ZOA text priorities for the June meeting.
I'd like to get through this one and
This last one very quickly. Does the commission have any further marching orders for me, aside from what was just being discussed? So things that you want me to look at. We have under item D, a discussion about food trucks, but if there's anything out there that you want, let me know.
Okay, the mayor has already, I think, voiced his concern that we keep lumping more and more on a pile and we don't move the pile. Let's get these things done.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think the answer is not at this time.
Well, we already gave you one thing, and we're going to probably move into another thing that you'll be working on, so if you're looking for work, we'll give you a little.
I don't want to belabor C, but Mike, you had brought up townhouses and density at the last meeting. Is that what you meant by the townhouse on your agenda here?
Correct. So, again, a few months ago, this was kind of initiated by me, and it was basically, based on my observations of what you have and what you don't have in the zoning ordinance, and, trying to speak at least generally, there's a few redevelopment sites within the city that people have spoken about this as a potential design product that they would like to use. My position or argument is that if we do eventually see these things, it's good to be proactive and have some standards in place or drafted, because sometimes when you develop this particular product, they can be done reasonably nice and attractive and well-designed, or you can just load them up and it'll end up looking like a Berlin Wall effect. So what I was trying to encourage the Planning Commission meeting, saying if this is something that they believe to be potentially a future pending issue, and if you agree that it has some merit, then again, something I could jump onto and provide for draft revisions.
And Mike, what's driving this from your standpoint is we are an urban, tight, that density sometimes is the issue, that our zoning codes don't allow the density that you're thinking would be a good thing for the city of Norwood. And by putting some additional language in, it would allow developers, for instance, in an art. I'm just trying to figure out exactly.
That's partly, but I would say, as a counter defense, the city of Norwood has pretty decent standards in place for relatively dense development. So whether you would have a single family, a semi-detached, or a duplex, you already have pretty decent standards to allow for higher densities. So it's not like Blue Ash or something saying, we're not going to go under 10,000 square feet for a lot, and we want to have 2,000 square foot homes. The city of Norwood has pretty decent existing provisions. My point being more, not so much based on, as you're hearing from Cincinnati, a push for more density, more affordable housing, blah, blah. While that's somewhat relevant here, it's more, hey, you don't really have detailed provisions for townhouses in your zoning ordinance. And if you believe that that product will be pushed more by builders and developers in the future, it's something maybe you want to revisit to have more robust or better design options for them.
On the other hand, since we do not have it, it almost tells developers the city's not really interested in that type of unit. I mean, when you talk about a row house, look in the city of Norwood, the only row houses that we really have are the homes that are down on Harris Avenue that have never been what I would consider to be real Class A housing. If there's a development that's going in, what kind of row houses are they going to put in, or what kind of townhouses are they going to? And I look at it almost like we've heard whispers that potentially could happen, but that's all it's been, is rumors and some whispers. And we're not to a point, and nor do I think that the people we've heard whispered about are at a point where they're going to come to the city with something. So I think that's where originally this started, is starting hearing some whispers that maybe
Conversations.
somebody was going to try to do that. So
We have one on Globe. They just went to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Board of Zoning Appeals granted the variance for the townhomes on Globe and Lawn just recently,
If I'm not mistaken, it was 3 units?
3 units.
3-unit on Globe with garages underneath?
Off-street parking, one stall for every unit.
But no street parking then?
Correct.
They're not building an apartment and saying the streets have to absorb this. They're saying every single unit will have a parking space dedicated in the design.
I recognize that, but when you take a single-family home or you take a one out that's a lot, you've got one driveway potentially going out there and you've got some parking on the street. When you do a townhome and you say, this garage is under that one, this one's under that one, this one, you take 40 feet of parking that used to be 10 feet for a curb cut, and now it's 40 feet of curb cut because every garage has to have access to that street and nobody can park along that. So, when that situation comes up, you start thinking, maybe we really should be looking more closely at what we would allow and not allow. You're talking about a townhouse, a row house is different. Typically, a row house sets up closer to the sidewalk, has a much smaller area between the public right-of-way, and then they have parking in back. And that's sort of what I was thinking was being whispered about for another area. So there's definitely a difference between a townhouse and a row house.
What
And
you just described is how Globe is. It's very tight to Globe Ave. It's close to the,
they can park a car in front of the house.
in there underneath the house. The garage is actually underneath the structure. You pull in.
Well, that's not what typically I look at as a row house is sitting right in the front and there's a stoop on the front and you go inside from that. A townhouse has got some, if you look at Mount Lookout, they've got some different townhouses. They'll have a parking pad in front of the garage so they can put one car, maybe two cars in the garage, but then one car there and then and just 10 feet over is another one of those. So there's no parking in between. There's no, so it eliminates a lot of parking. So that could bring up a lot of issues in the city, and maybe is something that planning. We should be looking more closely at it. So
Why don't we just keep it on the agenda for next month? When we get, and I think that we do, and Carrie's right, that the BZA did approve.
It's the only reason they went to you was for setbacks, front yard setbacks, side yard setbacks. They didn't, they provided the parking. Dan didn't write that. It was in a zoning district that allowed for 3 families, so it had that R3 zoning district to it. So they only came to BZA
For the setback.
for the setbacks, and BZA asked them to make the face that fronts Globe, which is the side of the building now, give it
More
some kind of an
residential. Right.
architectural detail that made it look like the other houses. It's at the 5100 or 5200.
But don't get me wrong. I'm not for or against either way right now. I understand you guys are just explaining the situation and how it came to the city. What I'm saying is we're the planning commission. And when it comes to planning, that doesn't happen overnight. We should be looking at this, and we should be looking at not only the pluses, but the minuses of it, and trying to put ordinances, zoning in place to make sure that it's the best thing for our community. So I agree with you. I think it should stay on the agenda, and we should discuss it, maybe have more discussion of how other communities are put plans in place to facilitate this potential, type of housing that could become more prevalent, since we do have some, become more prevalent in the city. So if you would, I think that's a logical way to move forward.
And then we'll get off of item C, or what was your parking standard? Just to make sure I understand. It's not the parking overlay, that's the parking standard. What did you mean by that, so that we?
It was more if you wanted to revisit either ratios sometimes, or that whole section that we have for
Okay.
additional standards. But again, even, let's say, porous paving is kind of a parking standards as to where it's found.
Okay. Why don't we just table that one for now, and let's keep going on, unless other members of the planning commission would like to take a more detailed conversation on.
Yeah.
I just, personally, my only comment on parking standards, Rookwood, because I did get out and measure them, had unbelievably tight standards compared to the rest of what I've put in my 40-year career. So, and I know that I did check with your zoning, and it's approved what they have, but man, they are tight. So that's what, when you said parking standards, I think of width of a parking stall.
Okay.
As cars get bigger, it gets harder. Okay. If everybody is okay with where we're at, let's move to item D on the agenda. Mike, help me out on this one. This is,
Sure. So there has been discussion circulating, and we had an issue at the BP service station site where we have food trucks essentially operating within the city, and
Hold on, we're on food trucks, or we're on this, I thought we amended the agenda to add, or is that after this? I
I'm
guess the
sorry,
letter from you.
I modified the agenda to be C1C now instead of C1D.
Okay, I'm sorry.
And now we're on to the
I'm sorry. I didn't
highlighted
interrupt.
item D.
All right, sorry about that, Mike.
yeah, no problem. So
Okay.
essentially the food truck, it's at this point starting, I wouldn't say becoming contentious, but there's a lot of issues that are floating around. Staff, specifically Mark Reeves, having issues with regards to potentially these particular activities starting to go at particular places, wanting some additional relief in terms of further utilities, electrical service, just the amount of activity. We have some people that are more supportive of these sort of uses. I believe people have reached out to various council members. So what I was trying to do here is at least provide a background, and this is more an advisory at this point for the Planning Commission meeting. So municipalities can regulate these activities either through zoning or as a licensing item. And at least my experience and sometimes preference is that there's more opportunity to regulate these things through licensing. So it's not unreasonable or unheard of people regulating these as a zoning matter, but at this point, as per a discussion that we had with Noah Powers, one of the counselors, and myself and Mark Reeves last Monday, we were going to kind of have a further discussion, at least from the internal staff level, and report back to Noah Powers as to different options. And then he would kind of also discuss directly with the mayor to kind of let you know in terms of what's happening. Because I think at this point, I believe Mark Reeves would like to kind of at least regulate them what we can do. But at this point, the frustration for staff is that we don't have the necessary enforcement mechanisms or tools to fully do what we think we probably should do. And at the same time, I think there is some general support for these activities within the city. So it's trying to walk that fine balance as to regulating, but at least providing for reasonable use of these activities. So.
I think I disagree when you say it's licensing, and either licensing or through zoning.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's these activities are licensing, and zoning restricts certain things that they can do, and that happens not just with mobile food trucks and that happens with all sorts of different activities, business activities that happen in this city. There are there's zoning problems, and those are hoops that are put in place for them to jump through for specific reasons. So it's not either or. There is definitely both put in place for specific reasons. I think that when we talk about mobile food trucks, that's great, and these people that want to be entrepreneurs and start their mobile food business is fine. But putting infrastructure in so that your mobile food truck can sit on the corner and become a permanent fixture in a permanent restaurant, that's not a mobile food service, that's a restaurant. And zoning and all the health regulations and all those have to be applied to that. So it'll be a more interesting discussion as we get more information, and I know Noah's going to work on some parts of that, but I don't think this is a decision that has to be made in the Planning Commission right now, but I do think it's something that, and you're absolutely right, there's public interest, there are political people that are becoming involved in this, and they just have to understand the reasons why these licensures are required and why the zoning requires certain things, and we move on from there. So it's going to be, I think over the next few months, we'll see a lot of information come out on this, and we'll see a lot more understanding of why certain rules are there to protect our community. So
I could just ask a question, because I do not frequent food trucks. That doesn't mean I'm against them. I'm not against them. I don't frequent them because I never knew whether or not our health commission certifies them, like they certify our restaurants. And to me, that's one of the, I can smell barbecue when I ride up Montgomery Road and go into Pleasant Ridge, but I don't stop because I don't think there's a city certification from the Board of Health. And I'm just, if I were going to, and I'm not going to get into this study, but to me, that's a major, fits your licensing. But I do agree with it's a zoning issue as well, but I've always assumed since BP is selling food, whatever, that it kind of falls underneath that they're selling food. But they don't have striped parking, they don't have a lot of the things that typically you would expect. I'm always just curious on those food trucks. Wherever they go and sell, do they have to be licensed by the Board of Health in your municipality? So, Mike, as you get into the discussions, it would be, I think, an interesting question. Do they have to pay for that fee to be done so that exactly where you ended, there, Vic, do we have a community responsibility by letting these sell in Norwood, that it's almost saying to the citizens of Norwood, we have approved it?
The city of Cincinnati does. When you apply for a license, the health department does come out and do checks, and they have a checklist of things that have to be done. And it's free if you do it between the business hours, but if you have to go outside the business hours for them to come, there's a fee for that. But they do have to have approval from the health department. They do have to have that license. But I was also doing a little research. In Arkansas right now, they're having this debate about the electric poles. And that's exactly what you said. All of a sudden, when you have the electric pole, a permanent fixture there, they're no longer a mobile food truck. They're a permanent food truck. So I understand the need I understand why they would want to have electric. It's quiet. It probably makes things so much smoother and so much easier. It probably helps when you have a generator, you have the fumes, you have the noise. I understand the desire to have the electric, but I also understand that it all of a sudden isn't a mobile food truck. Those trucks are sitting at BP 24/7. They're not going to their driveways. Another thing is I don't think they should be sitting on a residential street either. So what is the solution? I know that one of the coffee vendors takes his truck home every day and he puts it in his driveway. He backs it in so he's not taking up parking spaces. And that's the perfect situation. So I don't know what the answer is right now. I don't know, but I do know that they're sitting there all the time. They never move unless they have a private event.
I know over in Kentucky, I think it's in Boone County, they have an area that is set up where they do like the Pike Street Market. They do the farmers market, and they have installed electric so that there's electric facilities there for people to come up, and they have food truck day, and they can hook up to that electric. But they're not permanently sitting there. You can go past there all the other times, and that area is sitting. There's not a food truck sitting there. It's at certain times. So there's infrastructure put in place, but it's for mobile food truck vehicles to come there and do it. So, like I said, I think there's going to be a lot more education over it. I absolutely, I mean, our health department, even when there's a festival or some sort of outdoor food sales event, they're coming out and checking, and they're verifying the temperatures of the meats, and they're doing all the different things to keep our community safe. I'm sure that they are doing somewhat of the same with the, I'm sure they are. That's a good question for our
But same
health
way with
department.
electric too. When a festival goes, and sets up a festival now, you have to act like it's a permanent building and go to IVI and get their inspectors to come out and certify that.
So I'm sure there are
It's
a
a-
lot of hoops that one of the food truck vendors could come in and say, oh my gosh, the city has all this. You got to get a business license, you got to get a health department license, and then you've got all the other, so there's probably plenty of it, but we need more communication of what are all the hoops they're jumping through. And maybe once we find all those things out at the planning commission, we'll end up going to them because we feel like, oh, they're clean, they're safe, let's get to them. So it could be
I
a
agree.
good time to do that.
So, Mike, you started off by saying that there is already a group, you know, and others who are already talking about this topic on what would be the next step.
Correct. So what I'm hoping to do, either at the end of this week or whatever, at least get back to Noah Powers with regards to at least some initial survey that I was starting to do, what other municipalities are doing, and including in terms of what is the state law with regards to how it's being done. So, as I'm kind of researching and getting down the rabbit hole, it's kind of interesting how these things are regulated or not regulated. So, but at least answering the question for public health, definitely the state law for food services, for food establishment, provides criteria, and it's pretty much, for better or for worse, delegated to county and local governments to have their health departments then follow through. And then there's also associated Ohio Fire Code regulations as well. So there's a lot of provisions that they adhere to, but it's all kind of delegated to the local governments to follow through with.
So your recommendation is that you're bringing this to the planning commission to let us know that this is being reviewed, and
Well, at least my marching order is to return the information to Noah, and then
Okay.
probably he can best decide as to how it should then proceed.
so it's almost like just keep this on the agenda for next month?
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
You'll come back with, okay. I think Noah agrees. I didn't hear anything there.
Now, you agree to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. I think that we ought to keep this on the agenda. There may be a potential that we would want to look at zoning changes, and as we get a little bit more information, I think we'll have a better idea of that.
Very good. Okay, the modified agenda had item E, which was the handout that was given by Carrie on the New City Presbyterian Church located at 44 Floral. I'm getting my meetings mixed up. This was brought to BCA or to here?
No, this was brought to Planning Commission last month,
Last
where
month. I didn't-
New City Presbyterian and Jeff Reichert representing had asked Planning Commission to recommend a zone change from R2 to office
office.
zoning. Planning Commission moved not to
Correct.
recommend that zone be changed, and your recommendation went to council. Council read your letter and set a public hearing, and this is New City Presbyterian Church withdrawing their request for the zone change. It was sent out and addressed to Norwood City Council, but sent out to me for Planning Commission also. And since you were meeting today,
So this is more for information. They're going to go then through the normal process to Dan Bly underneath an R2.
right,
And-
they have
Okay,
now submitted for a zoning review to the building department based on the R2 zoning district versus the office zoning, which they had hoped there would be support for.
so Dan will then do what he normally does, look at what needs, what it meets and what it doesn't meet as far as an R2, let them know that, and they can make a determination then, do they go to the next step of requesting variances
Correct,
underneath the R2?
correct.
Okay, so I think that for this agenda item, this is just really informing the planning commission. We listened last month, we gave them an answer, the council then, they now have pulled that request and are going through in the district that it's addressed right now, which is an R2. Is that all
Yes.
correct? Okay. Any questions?
I think an interesting point of this is that there were 3 steps that could have been taken with this when they came to the Planning Commission. We can approve it, or we can let it wither on the vine and do nothing, or we can not recommend it and send it forward to council. So the fact that we did not recommend this, there was a letter provided to council, and council then has to set a public hearing, and prior to the next council meeting, they have to have a public hearing, right? Everything has to go out, and council has to then hold a public hearing for this. If we take one action, either way, we approve it or don't approve it, there's a
Recommend.
public hearing, or recommended, there's a public hearing. But as a planning commission, we can take no action, and basically it stops. If we take no action on it, it doesn't move forward to council, there's no public hearing, and the planning commission sees it no further. And I think that's an important aspect to remember. If we would have, at that time, had this discussion and knew that they were not going to move forward with it, we could have just stopped at that point and not made a recommendation at all. No letter would have went to council, and nothing would have moved forward. So it's important to recognize what sort of the process is potentially in the future.
And I think their decision, as it says, was based on the community feedback. So I think they heard your recommendation and heard the community feedback and went back and thought about it and talked about it and decided they didn't want to go through that route.
Okay. We understand the process. That's the big part. Because when it went up in front of council, I was like, wait a minute, what? We recommended it not go, but
I'm sorry.
the correct legal process is that it has to go to council for that, so, okay.
And I'm learning that process. I guess if we would have done nothing, just to follow that train of thought, so they came to council, came to the planning commission to be heard, we could say we're not going to hear this item? Is that what I'm trying to make sure I understand what you were saying, Vic.
No, I think it would make it on the agenda. We would have that discussion. We would hear the public, just like we would, and then
Move to
that
take
would be
no
it.
action?
We would do nothing. Yeah, we would not take any action.
Then their recourse is,
I'm not sure that they have recourse. If you can't get through the planning commission,
because they can't get to council.
can't get to council.
Like the same way with BZA, they have to go through Dan Bly to get to BZA.
Correct.
Yes, again, I'm learning. I didn't know that we had the ability not to respond, but I understand it. Okay. All right. Any other comments before I make a motion that we adjourn?
I would make a motion we adjourn.
I'll second. Gary?
Mayor Schneider,
Yes.
Chairman Powers,
Yes.
Mrs. Sickinger,
Yes.
Mr. Hockney,
Yes.
Mr. Sewer.
Yes.
The time is 4:33 and this meeting is adjourned.